Stop Exeter.
Welcome to Next Stop Exeter, here in our spacious studio at Exeter High School. I'm Paul Nicholson, your host. Joining me today is HansHug Jr. Hans is the proprietor of Sonar Search and Recovery right here in Exeter. Hans, welcome to our studio.
Thank you, Paul.
Hans, I have to admit, there's so many things in the outdoors that I enjoy, but one thing I've never done before is ever partake in any sort of scuba diving. And it appears that you've been able to actually build a business based on scuba diving. So we'd love to hear more about your business, which I understand is not your primary business.
No, it's not. No, it's not. When I speak in public, for example, up around the Lakes region to the historical societies, excuse me, people often ask, do you make a lot of money doing this? And I said, I don't really make as much money as I'd like because it's not my primary business. I sell insurance for a living. But in 1988, my brother Chris got me interested in scuba diving. And my interest in scuba diving for the last 28 years has brought me in, in 2006 to buy a side scan sonar unit for my boat. My interest in diving and my interest in history was one of the reasons I bought different kinds of sonar gear over the last 10 years, using the Lakes region as an example, although I dive all over New England, scallop diving, lobster diving off Massachusetts, diving in the Connecticut River. My primary interest in the last 4 to 5 years has been focused on Winnipesaukee and shipwreck hunting. And in the last 5 years, I've found, give or take a couple, 70, 75 shipwrecks just in Winnipesaukee. So it started with diving. I added sonar to help me, side scan sonar to help me search for things of interest, primarily shipwrecks, but it also blossomed into a side business. People, believe it or not, will lose cars and trucks through the ice, snowmobiles. Without sounding morbid, I do look for bodies now and then. People need to relocate their moorings because the ice will drag them away. We can do what's called a geophysical survey. Someone wants a pipeline surveyed to see if it's been damaged. Side scan sonar has many, many commercial and recreational applications. I use it for both, for hire. For example, on Interstate 495 in Newburyport, we know they're replacing that bridge. Mm-hmm. I got a call last fall from the demolition company hired to remove the foundations for the old bridge. And what they need is a survey of before and a survey after of the river floor to determine, did you do what we asked you to do? This would be the state of Massachusetts making sure, without dispatching divers, to make sure all of the remains of the footings are gone. And side scan sonar will allow you to generate a three-dimensional image of the ocean floor or the river floor or the lake floor. Some people have a hard time visualizing what side scan sonar is. It is the use of sound to generate a three-dimensional image of the bottom. Much like when a pregnant woman gets a checkup, they use ultrasound. They'll move what's called a transducer over the abdomen. Well, they're injecting sound into the body to generate that image. We do the same thing, but on an industrial scale. Pretty much like ultrasound on steroids. I mean, you can do incredible things with it. For example, the El Faro tanker that sank down in the tropics, they found that in 15,000 feet of water with side scan sonar. By projecting sound into the water, the sound bounces back and they generate an image on a computer screen, and they can lock in on what we call a target. They can get the latitude and longitude of an object of interest. They can measure its height, its width, its depth, among its location and other things.
Can sonar tell you some way, somehow, the type of material you're looking at?
Absolutely.
Does a wooden ship look the same as a steel ship?
Absolutely. Without getting deep into the physics of sound, hard surfaces will bounce back the sonar wave, what we call a ping, better than a soft target. For example, depending upon your age, you may have watched the old World War II movies when they have the submarine warfare and the guys are in their sub and you hear ping. That's the sound being projected out from the submarine to find other submarines, and it bounces off and then comes back. Depending upon the strength of the return, the frequency you're sending it out at, the distance you're going, the type of water you're in, salt water, fresh water, muddy water, like the Mississippi River, you can indeed distinguish metal from wood, from plastic. For example, I have some very interesting sonar images down in Paugus Bay of milfoil, the invasive species that hangs up in the water column. Remarkably clear, and you can see exactly where the milfoil begins and exactly where the milfoil ends. So New Hampshire DES employs side scan sonar to do, again, what's called a geophysical survey, where they can distinguish metal, plastic, fiberglass boats, wooden hulls, marine growth, stone versus gravel, rubber versus steel. Yes, with the right equipment and the right operator, you can determine immense amounts of things about what we call the target.
You mentioned doing work in the Merrimack River. We have the Piscataqua River here, which, from what I understand, has some extremely strong currents.
Yes.
A lot of bridge building been going on there
Yes.
for the past
Yeah.
couple years. Have you had any experience in diving in that river?
The Piscataqua is the Wild West. It's a fascinating place. I do know many, many divers. Don Stevens, who owns Atlantic Aquasport in Rye, has been there many times. A lot of divers who live around here have been there many times. I have got so many different places to dive. The Piscataqua, as interesting as it is not a priority. And there are two reasons. First and foremost, the boat traffic. It's an extremely dangerous place to dive because of the traffic. Commercial traffic, recreational traffic. The other is the current, as you said. The current there can go probably 7 or 8 knots. The only way to safely dive into Piscataqua is at slack tide, when it's neither coming in nor going out. I'm not saying it can't be done. People go there all the time. But between the Connecticut River, the Massachusetts coast, the lakes here in New Hampshire and Maine and Vermont, I've got my hands full.
Well,
in terms of places I'd love to go, but the traffic and the tide timing, there's a very narrow window to get in there. It's quite difficult.
I have very limited experience in terms of what the Connecticut River looks like from top, the full length of it. But from what I see, it doesn't appear to be that deep of a river.
That's correct. The Connecticut River begins on the Canadian border. First Connecticut Lake, second Connecticut Lake, and third Connecticut Lake, I believe, form the pool that starts the Connecticut River running all the way down to Lyme, Connecticut. I've dived large areas of the Connecticut River. The typical depth, might be anywhere from 10 to 40 feet. Easily, particularly under bridges, you'll find 50 to 60 foot depths. Down in Gill, Massachusetts, just south of what's called the French King Bridge, there's a bizarre anomaly. It's a hole straight down through the rock, 125 feet deep, just this shaft going straight down. I know because I ran my sonar over it, in this case my depth finder, which is a form of sonar, and it was pinging 40, 44, 40, 44, 125. So the average depth is about 30 to 40 feet. It can easily go 50 to 60 with some strange anomalies like the holes down in the Gill, Mass area. That's a great place to dive as well because my passion for history fits quite well with the Connecticut because settlers started exploring the Connecticut in the 1600s. And where people go, they leave traces. no matter what you're looking for, whether it's Winnipesaukee or Sebago or the ocean or the Connecticut. There's lots and lots of great stuff to find in the Connecticut. Pottery, guns, new guns, old guns, arrowheads, a lot of stuff from the logging industry, the bateau, the rowboats that were probably 30 feet long that they used to deliver food out to the loggers on the water, big sections of boom chain, the peavies they used to roll the logs, those big spike tools. Lots and lots of stuff to find in the Connecticut.
Would you prefer to, given a choice, diving in the ocean, lakes, rivers, is there a medium that you prefer the most? Rivers sound more dangerous perhaps than still bodies of water like a lake or a pond.
In terms of, they all fascinate me. What I happen to like about the last 4 or 5 years of intensive searching and diving in Winnipesaukee is that, first of all, there's no salt water. So the shipwrecks or whatever you're looking for don't corrode at the rate they would in the ocean. We have no worms called teredo worms that will eat wooden ships alive in the ocean. So it's fresh water. You don't have to rinse down your gear. You don't have to flush your engine at the end of the day. The second, of course, is because it's standing water, there's no tide and no current. I'll dive in tides and currents all the time, but you know, if you want to, it doesn't get any easier than diving in fresh, stable water, which the Connecticut is not. It's fresh, but it moves all the time, and they generate hydropower there. And if you're not careful, you could be caught off guard, because when they open the floodgates to generate electricity, the water level can come up in an hour 6 feet. So you got to know what you're dealing with, where you're diving. You got to pay attention.
You mentioned Winnipesaukee and fresh water. How fresh is the water in Lake Winnipesaukee? I have this vision, you have all these communities surrounding that lake, a lot of vacation homes. Don't know how good of a job they do there with keeping that water clean.
New Hampshire DES is quite vigilant. The boating community up there is quite vigilant. You'll always get, for lack of a better word, your yahoos who will throw beer bottles in the water. But in terms of, I think, the kind of pollution issues you're talking about, it's extremely regulated. And Winnipesaukee, like Squam, like
Sunapee,
there really are gems. They really are gems. The water is spectacular. Winnipesaukee has a lot of different personalities, though. You go up on the north side of the lake, such as Lee's Mills, Moultonborough, and the water is the color of iced tea. That's from all the tannic acid of the leaves leaching out into the water. The water's not dirty, it's dark. And the reason for that is the nature of the geology up there is so narrow that the water doesn't have a chance to move the way it would in Alton Bay, Weirs Bay, Paugus Bay, open bays, which will turn over. It's kind of held on to. But as a rule, to answer your question, Winnipesaukee is beautiful on a good day. The visibility, depending upon your depth, could be a good day, 40 feet. Now, for those who might have been snorkeling in Aruba, you know, 100 foot, 100 feet. This isn't Aruba, of course, but it's really, really nice.
I'd rather take my chance of getting attacked by a lake trout than a barracuda in Aruba. So I'd be far more comfortable there.
Snapping turtles.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, have you found anything in Winnipesaukee of note? People have hired you to, find automobiles, snowmobiles, trucks, et cetera, et cetera.
I found snowmobiles. I'm looking now for, if you remember, the automobile called a Toronado from probably the 70s or 80s. It was a front-wheel drive American car, a Toyota pickup truck, a banana yellow 74 El Camino off Welch Island, because of the presentations I make around the Lakes region at the request of historical societies. People come to hear me speak. And one thing I like to ask them is, like, after you hear my presentation, if you think there's something I'd be interested in finding, come tell me. So people will tell me about all kinds of oddities, primarily tractors, dump trucks, cars, snowmobiles. But in a historical perspective, the steamboats on the bottom up there are numerous. I've probably found 30 or 40 steamboats going back to probably 1830. Some of them, many of them, have steam engine components still on board, propellers in place, seating in place, the hulls are intact. The history up there is wonderful, wonderful, and I love looking for things related to old Winnipesaukee, like the steamer Mount Washington. That was a spectacular find for me.
So you found it. It was lost, and Hans found it, or did somebody else find it and
actually,
he wasn't sure where it was?
Here's the story. The steamboat industry began in about 1830, 1820, across the country. And in about, I think it was 1872, the steamer Mount Washington was built down in Alton Bay. The mount was about 180 feet long. It was a side wheel paddle wheel steamer, and for almost 50 years it never lost a dime for its owners. It was owned by private parties, then the railroads, when they combined rail with steam, which was an intelligent business move. Long story short, in December of 1939, this spectacular steamer, legendary throughout the U.S., burned at the pier at Weir Station. As the story goes, the railroad station next door had a potbelly stove with coal. Somehow the stove got out of control, burnt the station to the ground, and the fire migrated over to the steamer Mount Washington, and it burned to the waterline. Because it was the winter, they lower the water in Winnipesaukee, and she was what we call hard aground. The hull was up in the mud, and coupled with being hard aground and frozen in the ice, when they went to remove the remains, they blew it up with dynamite. And then they put it on barges and floated it out in the lake. A sonar operator I'm familiar with in 1994 did a side scan sonar survey of Weir's Bay and didn't find anything. The story also goes to, as you try to piece together news articles, which I do from archives, a lot of the pieces were barged out into the Broads, the big open water section of Winnipesaukee. That's the story. However, 2 years ago I started doing a pretty thorough side scan sonar survey of Weir's Bay, and in the process I found 9 sections of the original Mount Washington. It just astonished me. Not that they were there, but how much I found and how big they were. I found one 55-foot section complete with massive 4-foot deck cleats where they put the lines around, 3-inch diameter rope still on board, the railings are still upright, just spectacular. People have asked me, what's the coolest thing you ever found in Winnipesaukee? And I have to say, both of the paddle wheels. I've looked since it's 2006, and I'm not a professional at side scan sonar. I'm just very committed, and I'm fascinated by it, and I try my best to be as good as I can. I've looked at thousands and thousands and thousands of sonar images. In the fall of 2014, I found this object on side scan sonar. I'd never seen anything like it. I was completely baffled as to what it could be. So in about July of last year, I scanned it again, and then I dove on it. I dove on what we call the target, because as I said, the side scan sonar with your laptop will allow you to move the cursor over something you see, hit mark, and grab the latitude and longitude of the object. So I anchored on those coordinates, and I landed at the bottom in about 65 feet of water, and then I looked up and I'm thinking, oh, now I get it. It was the paddle wheel for the Mount Washington, but it was stuck on edge in the mud like a donut. Up. It wasn't laid down, it was sticking up. And because, as I said, when they removed the remains of the mount, they blew it up with dynamite to break up the hull and get it out of the ice, and in the process they sheared, if you take a circle and cut it half in horizontal, they sheared it in half with dynamite. That's what's on the bottom, a perfect half moon sitting on edge, 35 feet long, probably 18, 19 feet high up in the water column. I didn't know what I was looking at on sonar. I was studying it and wondering, and I passed it around to other sonar operators. I don't know what it. The minute I got down, I go, oh, okay.
So you actually went down?
Oh, I dive all of them. All right. I dive all of my targets.
So you found it on the sonar.
Yes.
Then you followed
I was
up
mystified as to what it was, but I had an ear problem, so I couldn't dive it. this fall of 2014 when I found it. I had a punctured eardrum. So while I was healing, I was scanning, but in last year I got to it, and the minute I got on the bottom, I'm looking up. I mean, I only landed about 20 feet away from it, and I'm going down through it, and I had to stop as I was descending because you can hover in the water column. I stopped, and I was just shaking my head. It's like, oh my God. People have been looking for the Mount Washington for 70 years.
So are you pulling on a cord so somebody on a boat knows that something important happened? I'm assuming you're not doing this by yourself.
No, in fact, I did dive this alone. I do a fair amount of what's called solo diving. I take certain precautions, but it was just too compelling. I said, I'm not waiting. I have one or two really good friends up there who dive on the lake with me all the time. I couldn't wait. One of them is a dive master with Dive Winnipesaukee, the dive store down in Wolfboro. His name is Brad Swain. I couldn't wait. And diving solo is not as dangerous as one might think. But it depends how you approach it. You have to think, you have to do certain things to minimize the risk. One thing I won't do, speaking of standing water versus river, I will not dive alone in moving water. I won't dive alone in the Connecticut. I won't dive alone in the ocean. Because if you have a problem, you'll be pulled away. At least in standing water, you know,
right.
You can come up near your boat and you're not going to get pulled away. But I found that paddle whale, and a few weeks later I was scanning more of the bay, and I found another image that looked very much like the first image. Now I knew what it was, another paddle whale. The only difference was this one was laid over on its side, but it had all the attributes of the first one, which is standing up in the column.
Closer to home here in Exeter, are there any or many diving opportunities?
It depends what you're diving for. The Piscataqua River would be a really good place to dive, particularly if you're looking for artifacts, pottery, arrowheads, guns, remnants of steamboats, barges, things like that. It really depends upon what you're diving for. You're not allowed to dive for lobster in New Hampshire. You can in Massachusetts.
But you couldn't dive for even one lobster?
No, not in New Hampshire. You can dive for scallops, which is something else I really like to do. But the season in New Hampshire is very, they make it really hard. Like, you can dive for scallops December to February or December to March. It's in the winter. So I'll just go to Massachusetts to do that. You can scallop dive all year round.
How far out do you have to go to get scallops?
Not that far. It's really a matter of depth and bottom conditions. Scallops, unlike lobsters, lobsters need rocks and what we call structure in which they can hide and lay their eggs, etc. Scallops are completely out in the open in gravel beds. So if you can find the right gravel bed, you will find scallops.
So you know where these beds are now, so you don't have to waste any time.
No, I know where they are, and we lock in with them on GPS. Oddly enough, scallops are migratory, and they will move. You can have a really fine bed 1 year off Calf Island around Boston and go back to the same area, and there's nothing there. They moved. But you get enough dive buddies, and we aren't greedy, and we'll share our little spots with us. I guess much the way a hunter might, you know, say, I got a good deer over here that last year, and that's probably where we should start again. So we share.
So you're not leery of getting seafood from the Boston Harbor, it sounds like.
I don't dive right in Boston Harbor because the water does concern me, shall we say, and the boat traffic, again, is just insane. We go out to the Boston Harbor Outer Islands. It's an absolute playground out there. Lobstering, scalloping, to your heart's content. And we bring home a lot of good stuff.
It sounds like you found a hobby that certainly meets your heart's content, and very happy to have you join us here in studio.
Thank you.
HansHug joined us today, and we look forward to seeing you on an upcoming episode of Next Stop Exeter. Thanks for joining us.